Welcome to the world behind midnight, where shadows breathe and silence speaks. Tonight, we descend where light fears to follow. They told us the mountains would be empty this time of year. That was the first lie we believed. 6 weeks after Blackridge Basin claimed 3 hikers in 72 hours. Our squad of 4 former Navy SEALs stood at the trailhead with gear that hadn't seen daylight since our last deployment ended. Abraham Leach didn't waste time with speeches. He spread the topographic map across the truck hood, weighted the corners with ammunition boxes, and traced the drainage system with a finger that had steadied rifles in worse places than this. The basin wasn't large, maybe 8 square miles of dense forest wrapped around a central valley, where every missing person report terminated in the same grid square. Rocco Chen checked his rifle for the 3rd time, muscle memory taking over where sleep hadn't come easy. Marilyn Hester packed medical supplies like she expected to use them. Trauma kits stacked beside standard first aid, the kind of preparation that comes from knowing optimism kills faster than bullets. Aubrey Banks stood silent, scanning the tree line with eyes that had learned to read empty spaces for movement that shouldn't exist. We weren't here because we wanted answers. We were here because the alternative was letting whatever lived in Blackridge continue operating unopposed. The first day taught us nothing, except that the forest was watching. We moved through Douglas fir and hemlock that stood too straight, too uniform, like rows of sentries maintaining position. Animal sign was scarce, deer trails that started strong, then vanished mid-path, bird calls that stopped when we approached, and didn't resume after we passed. Abraham kept us moving in tactical spacing, never bunched, never separated beyond visual contact. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was held breath. We found the first campsite at dusk, exactly where the last group had reported setting up before communication stopped. The fire ring remained, stones blackened but arranged in a pattern that didn't match recreational camping. Someone had disturbed them deliberately, spacing them wider, creating gaps that faced specific directions. Rocco crouched beside the ring and brushed ash aside, revealing claw marks scored deep into the stone itself. Gouges that ran parallel in sets of 4, too controlled to be random scratching. Marilyn photographed everything, while Aubrey established a perimeter. We didn't camp there. Abraham made that call without discussion, and none of us questioned it. We moved another quarter-mile uphill and set up cold camp. No fire, no lights after full dark. Rotating watch in 2-hour shifts. The first night passed without incident, if you don't count the sound that rolled through. The valley around 0300, a vocalization that started low and climbed into frequencies that made your teeth ache before cutting off abruptly. It didn't repeat. It didn't need to. Morning brought fog that clung to the ground like something living, moving against wind patterns, pooling in depressions, and rising in columns where terrain didn't support it. We broke camp in silence and continued deeper, following the drainage system Abraham had marked. Water moved strangely here. Creeks that should connect didn't. Streams that appeared on maps vanished underground, through gaps in limestone that looked carved rather than eroded. Rocco noticed it first, the way certain rocks bore smooth indentations at shoulder height, worn grooves that suggested something large had passed repeatedly, brushing stone with enough force and frequency to polish it. We reached the central valley by midday, the place where 3 separate search parties had reported equipment failure, communication loss, and overwhelming instinct to retreat. Standing there, I understood why. The valley wasn't geographically different from surrounding terrain, but it felt compressed, like atmospheric pressure had increased without instruments registering change. Trees grew denser here, canopy thick enough to turn noon into twilight, and the ground was soft, not with moisture, but with accumulated organic matter that muffled footsteps completely. Abraham raised a fist, and we froze. He wasn't looking at the tree line, he was looking down, at our feet, barely visible beneath layers of decomposed pine needles. Ran a trail, not deer, not elk, not anything that should be moving through British Columbia wilderness on 2 legs. The prints were elongated, canid in structure, but scaled wrong, too large, positioned in a gait that suggested upright locomotion. Aubrey knelt beside one and placed his hand inside it for scale. His palm didn't reach the edges. We followed the trail, because turning back without intel would mean coming back blind later. The prints led toward the valley's western slope, where exposed limestone formed natural escarpments and water disappeared into crevices. Too regular to be accidental. Rocco moved point. Marilyn covered our six. Abraham and I maintained center. Everyone's weapon low, ready but not flagged, breathing controlled, minds clear. The trail ended at a rock face where the creek bed simply vanished underground, swallowed by a gap in stone, barely 3 feet high. Abraham knelt beside the opening and felt the air. Cold wind pushed steadily outward, not in gusts, in constant flow that carried the smell of wet stone and something else, something organic and old and wrong. He didn't touch the entrance. He studied the ground around it, the disturbed soil, the scratch marks and moss, the way certain stones had been displaced inward as if something had entered recently and often. "This isn't a den," he said quietly. "This is an access point. We didn't go in. Not then." We marked the location, photographed the entrance from multiple angles, and backed away with weapons oriented on the gap until trees blocked line of sight. The rest of that day we spent mapping the valley, identifying other places where water vanished, where stone bore marks, where the forest felt wrong in ways that defied articulation. By evening we had marked 7 separate gaps in limestone, all connected to the same drainage system, all exhaling cold air in steady currents that suggested substantial open space below ground. Camp that night was tense. We rotated watch every 90 minutes, instead of 2 hours, because nobody could sleep longer than that anyway. Around midnight during Marilyn's shift, she woke us without speaking, just touched each shoulder in sequence, and pointed toward the valley below. Something was moving down there, multiple points of disturbance, visible only as shifting shadows against fog that had returned heavier than before. We watched for 20 minutes as shapes circled the valley in patterns too coordinated to be coincidence, never approaching our position, but making it clear they knew exactly where we were. Abraham made the decision before dawn. "We pull back," he said. "We assess. We return with what we need." Rocco didn't argue. Marilyn nodded. Aubrey looked toward the valley one last time, and I saw his jaw tighten. Retreat wasn't failure when it bought you time to understand what you were facing. We extracted from Blackridge Basin at first light, moving fast but controlled, maintaining discipline even as every instinct screamed to run. The drive back to civilization felt longer than it should have. We didn't speak about what we'd seen until we reached the rented cabin 40 miles south. A place with walls and locks and distance from trees that stood too straight. Once inside, Abraham spread the maps again, and this time we talked. Not about belief or skepticism, about evidence. 7 access points, coordinated movement, subterranean infrastructure. Whatever lived under Blackridge wasn't opportunistic. It was established. "We need to understand the system," Marilyn said. "Going in blind gets people killed." Rocco nodded. "And going in light gets people dragged." Abraham studied the topographic lines, the way they compressed around the valley, the elevation changes that suggested substantial hollow space below ground. "If it's limestone," he said, "then it's not one chamber, it's a network." The implications settled heavy. You don't fight networks with 4 people and rifles. You fight them with planning, resources, and people who understand confined space operations. Aubrey looked at me. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" I nodded. "We need specialists, not civilians. Not local law enforcement who want explanations we can't give. We need people who've operated underground before, who understand collapse risk and low visibility, and how to move when there's no room to maneuver." Abraham already had his phone out. "I know people," he said. "They'll come. They won't ask questions we can't answer." The first call went out that night. Abraham spoke in shorthand to someone who clearly understood the kind of help we needed, without requiring elaboration. When he hung up, his expression had shifted from tactical assessment to something harder. "They're mobilizing," he said. "But it'll take time." "How long?" Rocco asked. "Week, maybe more." Aubrey exhaled slowly. "That's a long time for things to change." Abraham's response was flat. Then we use it to prepare. The cabin became operations center. We pulled geological surveys, hydrological data, historical reports of missing persons in the region dating back 30 years. The pattern emerged clearly once you knew what to look for. Blackridge Basin sat atop a massive limestone cave system that extended miles beyond what surface terrain suggested. Sinkholes dotted the area, some documented, most not. Water vanished underground, in dozens of locations, feeding an aquifer that moved through channels carved over millennia. Maryland cross-referenced missing person reports with topography. Every disappearance clustered within 2 miles of known or suspected cave access. Every witness account that mentioned unusual sounds or sightings aligned with drainage points where surface and subsurface connected. "This isn't random predation," she said. "This is territorial defense." Rocco traced the watershed boundaries. "And the territory is bigger than the valley. It's the entire drainage basin." Abraham studied collapse patterns in similar limestone formations, places where natural cave systems had failed either through geological stress or human intervention. Controlled demolition wasn't simple when you didn't know structural load paths, when you couldn't see supporting columns or identify critical junctures. Too much explosive and you risk chain reaction collapse. Too little and you accomplish nothing except announcing your presence. "We need to map it first," he said. "At least the primary access routes." That meant going back. Not to hunt, not to engage, but to understand the system well enough to deny it. Aubrey checked equipment we'd need: climbing gear, redundant lighting, marking tools, short-range communications that might work underground if we stayed close enough. The plan was straightforward in concept. Enter through one of the smaller access points, map enough of the primary tunnels to identify choke points and load-bearing sections, then extract before provoking full response. The backup teams arrived 6 days later. 2 trucks, 8 additional personnel, former SEALs and Force Recon Marines we'd served with across multiple deployments. Abraham briefed them without embellishment. Subterranean cryptid activity, coordinated behavior, evidence of established territory spanning significant cave system. They didn't laugh. They didn't question. These were operators who'd cleared tunnel networks in Ramadi and cave complexes in Tora Bora. They checked their gear and asked for maps. We returned to Blackridge, with force multiplied, but mission unchanged. Mapping first, engagement only, if forced. The convoy parked 3 miles from the valley, far enough to avoid immediate detection, close enough to respond if extraction became emergency. Abraham divided us into 3 teams. Primary insertion team of 4, including himself. Security team of 6, maintaining perimeter and covering primary access. Reserve team of 2 holding equipment and medical, positioned at fallback point between vehicles and valley. The weather had shifted since our last visit. Temperature dropped, early snow dusting the higher elevations, wind carrying the smell of winter coming hard and fast. We moved into the valley at dawn, spreading into tactical formation, weapons ready but not flagged, every sense attuned to changes in environment. The place felt different this time. Not more dangerous, more aware. Like it had been waiting, and now recognized, we'd returned with intent. We approached the smallest access point, a gap in limestone barely 4 feet wide, where the creek disappeared underground through a channel that angled down steeply before leveling. Abraham went first, Rocco second, then me, Marilyn holding security outside until we confirmed the entrance was navigable. The air inside was cold and damp, stone slick with condensation. The smell of wet earth mixed with something organic and sour that clung to the back of your throat. 20 feet in, the passage opened into a chamber roughly the size of a small room. 3 additional tunnels branched from it, each large enough to move through upright, each exhaling that same cold wind that suggested they connected to larger spaces beyond. Abraham marked the chamber with reflective tape, photographing angles and measuring dimensions while Rocco scanned the tunnels with thermal optics. Nothing registered warm. Everything down here was stone temperature, which meant if something lived in these tunnels, it moved cold or knew how to mask heat signature. We chose the widest tunnel and advanced slowly, 50 feet at a time, pausing to mark and measure. Listening for any indication, we weren't alone. The passage descended gradually, floor worn smooth in the center where something had traveled repeatedly, walls bearing scratch marks that climbed higher than human reach. Marilyn documented everything while I maintained rear security, sweeping our back trail with rifle light, watching for movement that would indicate we'd been followed. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber after 200 feet, this one the size of a warehouse, ceiling lost in darkness above our lights, floor uneven with stone formations and pools of standing water. The smell was stronger here, concentrated, the scent of animal and decay, and something else that made rational thought harder to maintain. Abraham raised a fist, and we froze. He was looking at the far wall, where the chamber narrowed into multiple exits, 5 distinct passages leading deeper into the system. "We don't have time to map all of these," Rocco said quietly. Abraham nodded. We prioritized the largest. We moved toward the central passage, widest and most worn, when Marilyn touched my shoulder and pointed upward. I followed her light and felt my stomach drop. The ceiling wasn't natural stone. It was carved, worked, shaped by something with intention and tools, or claws capable of modifying rock. Grooves ran in parallel lines, creating channels that directed water flow. Architectural thinking applied to subterranean space. "This isn't a cave," Marilyn whispered. "This is construction." Abraham studied the ceiling and didn't disagree. We continued into the central passage, moving faster now, awareness growing that we were inside something designed rather than discovered. The tunnel ran straight for 100 feet before branching again, this time into a T-junction where both directions showed equal wear. Abraham marked left with tape, and we took the right path, following it another 100 feet to a chamber that stopped us completely. The space was massive, cathedral-sized with stone columns supporting a ceiling 40 feet overhead. But it wasn't the size that froze us. It was the contents. Bones, piled in organized sections against the walls, sorted by type, human skulls separate from animal remains, long bones arranged in stacks, ribs grouped together. This wasn't disposal. This was curation. Rocco swept his light across the collection, and I heard his breathing change. "How many people?" he said. Marilyn didn't answer immediately. She was counting, calculating. "Dozens," she finally said. "Maybe more." We documented everything, photographing from multiple angles, marking the chamber on our map, noting the 3 additional exits that suggested this wasn't terminal space, but a hub connecting to deeper sections. Abraham checked his watch. We'd been underground 40 minutes. Time to extract. We backtracked through the system, moving faster but maintaining discipline, pausing at each junction to verify we were following marked routes. The chamber with carved ceiling, the initial branching tunnel, the first room where we'd entered. We emerged into daylight 20 minutes later, and the security team immediately closed around us. "Anything?" Abraham asked. "Movement above ground," one of them replied. 2 separate positions. They withdrew when we oriented on them. Abraham nodded. "They're tracking us." We pulled back to the fallback point where reserve team waited with equipment. The debrief was quick and clinical. "System is extensive, deliberately modified, evidence of long-term habitation. Primary chamber contains significant remains, suggesting sustained predation over years. Multiple deep access routes require further mapping." One of the combat engineers, a woman named Sarah Vance, studied the photos of the carved ceiling. "This changes things," she said. "If they're modifying structure, they understand load distribution. Targeting random choke points could collapse sections we don't want to lose." Abraham agreed. "Which means we need comprehensive mapping before we place anything." Rocco looked toward the valley. "How much time do we have before they stop letting us walk in and out?" Abraham's expression was flat. "Less than we need." We ran 3 more insertions over the next 4 days, each time entering through different access points, building a composite map of the system. What emerged was sobering. The Blackridge cave network wasn't isolated chambers. It was an interconnected complex spanning at least 3 square miles underground, with major hubs connected by primary tunnels and smaller passages creating redundant routes between sections. The carved modifications weren't limited to one area. They appeared throughout the system, suggesting sustained effort over significant time. The bone chamber wasn't unique either. We found 2 others, both containing organized remains, both positioned near major junctions. Marilyn estimated combined count at over 60 human victims, based on skull inventory, with animal remains numbering in the hundreds. Whatever species occupied this system had been hunting successfully for decades, possibly longer, and had developed cultural practices around death that implied intelligence we hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Surface activity increased with each insertion. We were no longer moving unobserved. Shapes paralleled our movements through the forest, never close enough to engage, never far enough to ignore. They were tracking our patterns, learning our routes, potentially communicating between surface and subsurface elements. Abraham recognized the behavior. "This is reconnaissance," he said. "They're assessing our capability." The breakthrough came on the 4th insertion when we penetrated deepest into the system and discovered a chamber that changed our understanding completely. The space was circular, roughly 80 feet in diameter, with multiple tunnels radiating outward like spokes. But the center of the chamber had been modified extensively, stone worn smooth in concentric circles, and the walls bore markings. Not random scratching, but deliberate symbols, repeated patterns that suggested communication or record keeping. Sarah Vance, who had accompanied this insertion, stood in the center and slowly rotated, taking in the architecture. "This is a gathering space," she said. "Social structure requires these." Rocco swept his light across the marked walls, and if they're keeping records, they're passing information between generations. Abraham photographed the symbols methodically, which means this isn't instinct. This is culture. The implications cascaded. You don't negotiate with culture. You don't scare it away. You contain it, or you eliminate it, and elimination would require resources we didn't have. We extracted from that insertion, knowing we'd seen enough. The map was incomplete, but sufficient. We identified 6 major chambers that served as structural hubs, connected by primary tunnels, large enough for coordinated movement. Collapsing these hubs would segment the system, cutting it into isolated sections that could be addressed individually or simply sealed. The engineering was complex but feasible. The timing would be critical. Charges would need to detonate in sequence, starting from the deepest point and working toward surface access to prevent escape routes from closing before inhabitants could be driven toward controlled kill zones. The plan took shape over 2 days of intensive preparation. Primary team would insert deep, place charges at the gathering chamber and 2 adjacent hubs. Secondary teams would work simultaneously on mid-level chambers, coordinating placement through redundant coms and timed sequences. Surface teams would establish kill zones at known exits, positioned to engage anything attempting to escape during collapse. Medical would stage at the vehicles with evacuation routes, pre-planned to multiple hospitals. It wasn't clean. It wasn't guaranteed. But it was the best option we had for containing something that had operated unchecked for too long. Abraham gathered everyone the night before execution and laid it out plainly. "We've breached compounds and cleared tunnels from Helmand to Mosul," he said, "but never against something like this. We're not going in to hunt. We're going in to deny ground. Our SEAL training taught us controlled violence and disciplined extraction. That's what keeps us alive down there. Anything that moves toward us gets engaged, but our primary mission is placement and extraction. We don't chase. We don't investigate. We execute the plan and we leave." Insertion began at 0400, under conditions that felt apocalyptic. Temperature had dropped below freezing, snow falling steady, wind driving it sideways through the valley. Visibility was compromised, but that cut both ways. If we struggled to see, so did anything watching. Primary team moved fast, entering through the access point closest to the gathering chamber, carrying demolition packs that weighed heavier than combat loads, but contained precise amounts calculated for structural effect, without excessive over. We reached the gathering chamber, in 22 minutes. Faster than any previous insertion, because we weren't mapping, we were executing. Abraham and Sarah placed charges at 3 load-bearing columns, while Rocco and I maintained security, scanning tunnels that radiated from the chamber, listening for any indication we'd been detected. The silence was absolute. No movement, no sound, just cold stone and our controlled breathing. Secondary teams reported in via short-range comms. Charges placed at Hub 2. Charges placed at Hub 3. Primary tunnels rigged at calculated intervals. Everything running on schedule. We finished placement and began extraction, moving back through marked routes, weapons ready, expecting contact that didn't come. The silence was worse than engagement would have been. It felt like the system was holding its breath. We emerged at the vehicles 38 minutes after insertion began. All teams accounted for, all charges placed, detonation sequence loaded into remote firing system. Abraham checked positions one final time. Surface teams confirmed overwatch on primary exits. Medical reported ready for casualties. Reserve team secured the perimeter. He looked at me, and I saw the weight of what we were about to do reflected in his eyes. This was irreversible. This was final. He initiated the sequence. The first charges detonated deep in the system, muffled concussions that traveled through stone and earth, shaking ground beneath our feet. 3 seconds later, the second wave fired, collapsing mid-level chambers in coordinated failure that sent dust and debris venting from multiple surface access points. The final sequence targeted primary tunnels, cutting connections, sealing routes, turning a network into fragments. The sound was incredible. Not loud, but massive. Stone grinding against stone, pressure waves pushing air from gaps in limestone, the entire valley shuddering as tons of rock redistributed, according to physics we'd calculated, and prayed we'd calculated correctly. Dust clouds rose from a dozen locations, marking where the system had opened to surface, where it had closed forever, where something in between had occurred. Then came the second sound. Vocalizations, multiple sources, rising from underground and from the tree line simultaneously. High-pitched distress calls layered with deeper aggressive responses. Panic and rage mixed in frequencies that made your spine contract. Surface teams opened fire on movement near the northern exits. Controlled bursts, disciplined targeting. Something large and fast broke from cover and sprinted toward the southern perimeter, where another team engaged, dropping it 40 feet from the tree line. Abraham watched through optics, calling positions, coordinating fire, maintaining order as chaos tried to establish itself. 2 more contacts at the eastern exit, both engaged, both neutralized. Movement subsurface near collapsed access point Delta, non-hostile, likely trapped. The vocalizations continued for 6 minutes, growing fainter, spacing out, eventually falling silent, as whatever survived adapted to new reality or expired trying to escape. We held position for another 30 minutes, watching for secondary responses, confirming that dust had settled and no further collapse was imminent. Sarah moved from exit to exit, assessing results, checking that seals had held, that primary access points were truly denied. She returned with confirmation. System is fragmented, she reported. Major hubs collapsed cleanly. Secondary passages are blocked or unstable. Anything still inside is contained. Abraham nodded slowly. We extracted in convoy, moving fast but not reckless, leaving the valley behind as snow continued falling, covering our tracks, erasing evidence of human presence. 12 miles down the mountain, he finally let himself exhale. Rocco looked back once through the rear window. Think we got them all? Marilyn answered before anyone else could. Does it matter? The system's dead. They can't operate from it anymore. But I knew what Rocco was really asking. Whether something had escaped, whether this was containment or temporary disruption, whether we'd actually solved the problem or just relocated it. Abraham seemed to read my thoughts. We did what we could with what we had, he said. That's all anyone can do. The rest is monitoring, vigilance, response, if needed. Aubrey, who'd been silent since extraction, finally spoke. And if something did get out? Abraham's response was flat. Then we hunt it before it establishes somewhere new. We drove through the night and reached the cabin as dawn broke. The debrief was clinical. Successful insertion, successful placement, successful collapse. For confirmed surface kills, unknown number trapped or killed subsurface. Mission parameters met. Collateral damage, nil. Legal exposure, minimal given remote location and lack of witnesses. We filed no reports. We contacted no authorities. This was black from start to finish. The teams dispersed over the next 48 hours, returning to lives and jobs and routines that had been interrupted for something they'd never discussed publicly. Abraham stayed longest, burning maps, wiping data, erasing digital footprints that might raise questions later. Before he left, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You good?" he asked. I thought about it honestly, about what we'd found under Blackridge, about the bones, about the evidence of intelligence and culture that we'd buried anyway. "I'm processing," I said. He nodded. "That's fair. Just remember we didn't start this. We finished it." He drove away, and I was alone in the cabin with silence that felt different than it had before. Cleaner somehow. The weight that had pressed on my chest since those first missing person reports had lifted, replaced by something else. Not quite peace, but close enough. I packed my gear slowly, methodically, putting each piece away in its designated place. Before I left, I walked outside and looked north toward mountains I couldn't see from this distance. Snow had covered everything, smoothing terrain, hiding scars. Whatever had lived under Blackridge Basin was gone now, buried or dead, or scattered beyond recovery. The system that had sustained them was rubble. The territory they'd defended was denied, and if something had escaped, if some fragment of that population survived, then we'd cross that bridge when it presented itself. I got in my truck and started the engine. The road stretched south toward cities and people, and normalcy that would never feel quite complete again. Because now I knew what could exist in remote places, what could develop in darkness over decades, while humanity remained oblivious. And I knew that sometimes the only solution wasn't understanding or coexistence. Sometimes it was collapse. Sometimes it was making sure the ground itself refused to shelter what it had hidden too long. If you still hear the whispers after this, subscribe to The World Behind Midnight. Another story waits in the dark. Keep the light on and stay